So if we go back a little bit, can you describe to me...
I sometimes think when you say that,
whereabouts?
How far back you're in the studio.
Quite far back, actually. Can you describe to me your crucifixion?
Certainly. What would you like to know about it?
I'd like to know what happened.
Well, have you watched The Passion of the Christ? Yeah. If you have seen that, then if you take out all of the implications that the devil was behind it, and basically it went a bit overboard at the end in terms of the amount of whipping that I got, in the sense that they didn't do my front as well. There's this sort of time in that movie where it sort of shows me as a little bit obstinate and almost asking for another whipping almost, and that never happened. I was mostly whipped on my back and my legs and my buttocks and those kind of things, but not so much on the front. Occasionally on the front, but not so much on the front. But aside from that, all of that was pretty accurate in terms of the beating I received. It was, I found it very hard to move after that, obviously. Then I found I lost a lot of blood during that as well, which meant I started to, not have the strength that I would normally have. I was, in the first century, I was around 6 foot tall, and I was quite strong compared to the average person. In terms of the carrying of the so-called cross up to the hill, I carried a pole up the hill rather than a cross, and that was eventually what I was nailed to. So I was nailed to a vertical pole, not to an actual cross, because Pilate wanted to make a point that the Jews were the people who really chose to have me killed, and he wanted to kill me the way the Jews would normally hang a person, which was normally on a stake rather than a cross. And so I was hung the Jewish way, whereas the other two people who were called the evildoers to my right and left, they were hung in the Roman way. So they were hung on crosses, and I was hung on a pole. And on top of the pole, Pilate wrote a message basically trying to snub the Jewish Sanhedrin by saying that instead of saying he called himself the King of the Jews, he wrote on this message, King of the Jews, and put it at the top of the pole, much to the Sanhedrin's annoyance actually at the time, and they asked him to take that down and he refused to do so. In terms of my own pain and so forth and suffering, it wasn't any more pain and suffering than the average person going through a similar experience would experience, in the sense that it's not like there's sort of this feeling that is in many people, particularly Christians, that for some reason, because I was taking on the sin of the world, which is not true actually, but they believe that it's true, that for some reason, because I was taking on the sin of the world, that meant my pain was even more so than any other person who had been crucified in the same manner or beaten in the same manner. And that's not the case at all. In fact, because I was at one with God, I could manage the pain relatively well. And actually, Mary had more difficulty with my physical pain than I did, because when you start to have a connection soul to soul, the emotions that flow and the feelings that flow through one half of the soul flow through the other half too. So Mary actually had more distress at my pain, watching me be beaten and also watching the crucifixion, than I actually had. So I didn't experience a huge amount of pain. There was a time just before my death that I'm meant to have cried out and said, why have you forsaken me, to God? And that never happened. I knew God hadn't forsaken me. And I never had those kind of thoughts actually through my crucifixion. I knew it was totally the actions of people on earth that had decided upon my crucifixion. So I never made any comments to God that God had forsaken me or anything like that. And I died relatively quickly because of the amount of blood that I'd already lost during the whipping that I received. The whips were very similar to as described in that Mel Gibson movie. They had spikes on the end of them and claws on the end of them, and they had sort of like fish hooks almost on the end of them, and so you would get pretty much ripped up, and as a result of the ripping of a lot of parts of my body, I bled a lot, and as a result of bleeding a lot, I lost my strength during carrying the stake up to the hill to Golgotha, and I also lost a lot of blood, and so I wasn't as clearly sensing all of the pain as what I probably would have normally if I hadn't lost a lot of blood. And eventually I needed help actually to carry. That part's true in the Bible, that I needed help to carry the stake up the hill. And in fact, in the end, the guy that was helping pretty much half carried me as well as the stake up the hill, pretty much, because I was pretty much spent by then. And I was pretty conscious of everything going on around me emotion-wise still, and conscious of Mary's emotions, of my mother's emotions. There were two other women present, Salome, John, the Apostle John's mother. She was present as well, and another friend of Mary's was present, and Rachel, her name is, and so they, I was conscious of their feelings, of what was going on. John was also present, the Apostle John. So, but there were very, very few other people whom I knew that were present at the actual crucifixion, because firstly, the majority, it was sort of done in a fairly distant way from the majority of people for a start, and secondly, the people who were following us up to that point became very frightened and that they would be next, and so many of them hid in the city in Jerusalem or outside of the city, and so very few of them got to see the crucifixion at all, aside from Mary, my mother, a few other women, and a couple of men. There was only two men, in fact, present. One was John, and the other one was John Mark, who finished up writing the Book of Mark, and they were the only people present at my crucifixion. Then, as I died, I obviously, as soon as I died, my physical body separated from my spirit body and soul, and as a result of that, I started floating above my body. It was still hanging on the stake, and the Roman soldiers weren't certain as to whether I died or not yet, and so they actually speared the side of my body up into the heart, but my heart had already torn apart, and I'd already died, so I didn't feel all of that. When a person is hung with their hands above, and most of the weight is carried by this portion of the body, and eventually it starts, the inside organs start tearing apart from each other, and that's what happened to myself. So that's how I died. I died by my organs, and particularly the organs around my lungs and heart starting to tear apart because my muscles couldn't hold them all in the same position anymore. And eventually, as a result of that, I passed, separated from the physical body, and I then hovered above my body, watching the proceedings. So from then on, I was watching the proceedings rather than being involved in them, really. So it was really just a body on a stake. They broke my legs as well when my body was dead, just in order to hasten the process, because Pilate and the Sanhedrin wanted the task completed before the Sabbath began, and it was the day of that the Sabbath would have begun, and so they hastened my death, or what they thought was hastening my death, by spearing me and breaking my legs so that all of the weight pulled apart the body. But I was already dead by that stage, so I didn't experience the pain of that. So I then watched them take down the stake, take me off the stake. They gave the body to Mary, my wife, and then Mary and a few others carried my body to a nearby home in Jerusalem, and they started embalming my body. And at that stage there was a lot of grief. All of my mother, Mary, and the other women, and John and Mark present, they all had a lot of grief that they were feeling at the time. My father had bought a tomb some years prior when he decided that he was going to become a member of the Sanhedrin, which he was a member of the Sanhedrin that condemned me to death, but he wasn't present at the voting of, at the decision time. But he was actually a member of the Sanhedrin at the time of my death. But he bought a tomb, which is now in the Bible referred to as the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. It's sort of a way to distance myself from my father. There's a constant thing in the Bible of trying to distance me from my father by any reference to Joseph is always a reference directly to Joseph, not as my father or as somebody else like Joseph of Arimathea. The reality is there was a Joseph of Arimathea, but he was not my father. But it was my father who owned the tomb and not Joseph of Arimathea. So my father had bought this tomb, a family tomb that he bought near Jerusalem, and eventually that's where I was buried. And of course I watched my own burial, and I was trying to be with all of the people involved in the embalming of my body in order to just, help them come to terms with their grief and so forth. I had foretold to the disciples that, who were present that I would return to them, so after my death, and I told them that I would return to them around 3 days or after my death. I calculated that time based upon how long it was going to take for me to decompose my own body out of the tomb, because I could hasten the decomposition process of my own body. So I decided to decompose my own body so that if anybody checked the tomb, they would realise my body wasn't present anymore. And I wanted to do that so that anybody coming to the tomb and opening the tomb wouldn't be able to then claim that I'm still lying there.
So how did you decompose your body?
Well, it's very much the same as decomposing anything. You notice that if you put a vegetable material, any material on, outside in particular in the elements, over a period of time, it slowly disappears through natural processes. Of course, many times it's insects and other things, but if it's in a tomb, obviously there's not too many of those present, but decomposition still occurs. And all I did was, I knew the laws involved with decomposition is about providing extra oxygen to the process. So all I had to do is provide extra oxygen to the process and speed up the process of decomposition. And in doing that, I finished up decomposing the body within 2 days.
So how did you provide extra oxygen?
It's a matter of channeling energy. It's like, if you can, right now, that your entire body is just really energy. You're not really a physical person that, the only reason why it feels physical is because our energy is dense and therefore we're able to touch it. But it's actually vibrating energy. Electrons running around a nucleus is the understanding nowadays, and it's not strictly correct completely because there are actually smaller particles that also are in rotation inside of each cell and inside of each atomic structure. But once you understand how the energy flows, you can start channeling or moving that energy from one location to the other location relatively easy. The problem in the tomb was that there was not much light available for decomposition. Decomposition will speed up with light, speed up with heat, speed up with oxygen, and so forth. There's certain processes that you can speed up decomposition, and so all I did was provide all of those particular elements with the energy that I had from my own spirit body to speed up the entire process. And in speeding up the process, decomposed the body completely within 2 days, rather than it being years that it would have normally have taken to decompose, perhaps even hundreds of years sometimes. And in doing that, I set the stage, if you like, for somebody, if anybody decided to open the tomb to prove my earlier claims false. All I had done was speed up some of the things that I knew from God's laws of nature so that it decomposed the body, and that way anybody opening the tomb would then see the body missing. And since the Sanhedrin had posted 2 guards outside of the tomb, it would have been pretty hard to answer the question of where the body went. And that's exactly what finished up happening. And they knew my claim, of course, before I died, so they posted sentries to make sure no one would steal the body, because that's what they were worried about. They were worried that somebody would come along, steal the body, and then claim that I'd been resurrected in some way. Of course, there's no such thing as the resurrection either, because it's not really a resurrection. You're instantly in your spirit form. Your physical body can no longer be automated by any energy anymore, because the method of automation is through what's called a silver cord, which is an energetic stream that connects the spirit body and the material body. And that cord got severed during my death, which it gets severed during everybody's death, of course. And so it's impossible then for a body to be reanimated after the separation has occurred. So, and I knew that before I died. So one of the things that I then did was I allowed myself to pull together matter in a very similar way that I pulled together energy in order to decompose my body. I could also pull together matter and form a body. And so I formed a body, which I then animated using my condition, and appeared to Mary first. Mary was this was now 3 days later, basically. It's not 3 full days, but it was a bit later. After I'd decomposed the body, I appeared to Mary.
How did you make the body? Or how did you form the body?
Well, again,
how did you know that you could? It's kind of situation.
Well, all this knowledge, once you become at one with God, there is so much knowledge that becomes available to you about the laws of the universe. Much more knowledge than before you're at one with God. And so once you become at one with God, it's like all this knowledge, and it's not complete knowledge. You don't know everything, but there's a lot more than you know that you knew beforehand. And you know about how the laws work, like what laws govern the movement of matter, for example, what laws govern the physical body and how it works, what laws govern how matter can be pulled together and dispersed, what controls the dispersal and the pulling together of matter, which is actually all about using your will in harmony with love in a certain direction. And the will is so powerful that you're able to pull together, the different elements that you need from that are actually mostly available in the air around you, in fact, and pull them all together to form matter. And so that's all I did. I just basically pulled together the matter using my will in harmony with love, pulled together the matter in the manner that I'd learned through this relationship with God, so that I could create a body. And in fact, right now, there are people right on the earth right now who are actually spirits who have pulled together matter in the same way. And so it's a fairly common occurrence, much more common than what people believe, in fact. And in fact, there are many times within a person's personal life that they may meet a person who is actually a spirit who has pulled together matter and formed a human body, and there's no way that a person on earth can actually tell the difference. But when they try to trace down the person and find out where they live and all those other things, they find the person doesn't actually exist. And that's a very common occurrence, actually, on the planet. There are many people who experience that in the course of their life. Yeah. So it's a very common occurrence that spirits who have that knowledge can pull together matter and actually create a body that they can animate.
Can you just explain to me what you mean by matter?
Well, any matter larger than an adamantine particle, which is the smallest particle that we know of as spirits that exists on the earth, can be pulled together and then manipulated. So you can actually create atomic structure through that process. So this energy is present everywhere. And in fact, when you're a spirit, you see it in many cases, particularly if you've become very developed in love. You see how the matter connects, where the structure of it and how you can manipulate it. And it's all, but you are governed by the laws as to how you manipulate it. So you can't, and maybe the best way to illustrate is this. How does a woman who basically receives the sperm into the egg and then all of a sudden 9 months later there's a child. Where did all that matter come from? Well, it obviously came from within the woman herself. All that matter that constructed the child came from within the woman through her digestive processes and all the elements needed to construct the different forms of matter based on the genetic material and its construction, all got formed through a process that there are so many laws that govern. And we're used to this every day. Like when a child, is conceived and then is born, we expect the child to be 9 months mature rather than just a cell structure that hasn't grown. And where did all that matter come from? It came from the formation of the body through obeying the law of the genetic structure and the laws of life, which both of these laws are laws that God have made in order to formulate and construct eventually what becomes a child, the body of a child. And in fact, these kind of laws apply to all animals, usually all mammals as well, are all constructed in a very similar way. Now, if you know those laws as a spirit, then of course it makes sense that you can construct a body without needing to go through the process of, having be conceived, wait 9 months later until you're 9 months, and then born, and then wait until you're 20 before, you've got to the age that is relatively mature. You can do all of that without needing to go through a process that is automated through this, that most people don't understand at all yet, that is automated through the birth process. Now that process can be constructed by a spirit, and therefore a body can be constructed in exactly the same manner. Does that make sense? Yeah. So
I think this analogy, that was...
Yeah. And in fact, the exact same laws that govern the formation of the body of the child are the same laws that the spirit has to understand and use in order to construct a body that the spirit can animate. So it's exactly the same laws that are involved with the construction of the body of the child, with the exception that you're creating a mature body right from scratch. You're not actually having to go through a growth process. But the genetic material is a requirement, so the genetic material has to be present, and you can construct the body, and then you can dematerialize it immediately afterwards as well, using a very similar process in reverse. So